So welcome to our 92nd online gathering for congregational leaders across the country. This monthly gathering is called Courageous Leadership, and it's sponsored by ELCA's coaching ministry. I'm Jill Beverland. My pronouns are she, her. I am the program manager for this ministry and one of your facilitators today. As part of my traditional land acknowledgement, I would like you to know that my home is located on the Fox River in Appleton, Wisconsin. This area is the ancestral territory of 5 nations of Native Indigenous peoples: the Menominee tribe, the Ho-Chunk Winnebago tribe, the Potawatomi tribe, the Oneida tribe, and the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohicans and the Brothertown community. I honor and respect the diverse Indigenous peoples connected to this territory on which I live. As we step into our time today, I encourage us to remember that we are creating and holding a safe and brave space in these gatherings for you to bring the truth of who you are and how you are doing. These conversations are meant to be an intentional step to live more fully into God's dream for us as the body of Christ. And again, welcome to our time today. Our world this week has experienced a lot of heaviness, and maybe you have as well in your personal world. I want to acknowledge this and preface the rest of my introduction by stating that we feel tremendous grief and outrage for the atrocities that have happened in our country and in our world over these past days. From white supremacists slaughtering our siblings of color, to a beloved Palestinian journalist being assassinated in Israel, the war in the Ukraine, and other events of anguish that did not make the headlines, but we know are there. Humanity continues to show that we have an awfully long way to go in building the beloved community here on earth. We also want to acknowledge that it takes courage for us to continue to lead, to speak of hope, and to point to the healing promises of God in such a time. And it is our deepest prayer that gathering together in this space where we can name difficult truths, share one another's burdens, and remind one another of the resurrection love of Jesus at work already in the world, that this will encourage us to continue to live into our respective calls to be disciples and workers in God's kingdom here on earth. And part of the joy of serving alongside one another and gathering together is also the gift of laughing together. And it's through this lens that I will announce that I have enlisted the help of some fairly famous people to help us set the stage for our guest speaker today. So with that, I'm going to flip to my PowerPoint and hope to be able to begin sharing. Okay, thumbs up. Are you seeing it, friends? Okay, I need to get one other thing set, and then I'll be able to move forward. Okay, so some of us today have encountered conflict. And have you ever encountered conflict that felt like it was happening for ridiculous reasons, like the meme on the screen? I am really having tech trouble right now. There we go. And sometimes you might feel like you have so much conflict coming at you that Oprah herself is handing out conflict, just like cars to her audience. You get a conflict, and you get a conflict, and you get a conflict. But here, Buzz and Woody remind us that conflict is everywhere. And Master Yoda has shown up, friends, to encourage us in the midst of conflict as leaders, and to remind us that it's important to learn conflict resolution skills as early as possible. Because if we don't, Xena, the Princess Warrior, reminds us that your conflict resolution skills may come out looking a little like this. Or perhaps you've found yourself engaged in a Facebook conversation where you realize you're in a battle of the words. And I can tell you that this actually happened to me once, and it stopped only because my son texted me and said, "Mom, I see what's going down on Facebook. I want you to stop now. This is not going to end the way you think it's going to." And it wasn't a battle with him, by the way. It was a political thing. Here we have from The Office, Dwight Schrute, to let us know conflict is not bad. In fact, he's right. It's a normal part of being human and being in relationship. And here we have Lord Ned from Game of Thrones to encourage us that the way forward is to not simply avoid it. We need to be prepared. And so a thank you to all of my famous partners in helping to introduce our topic for today. And with that, I want to introduce you to our guest speaker. So we are so blessed to have the Reverend Sara Cutter with us. She serves as our Senior Director for Operational Effectiveness in the Christian Community and Leadership Home area of the churchwide ELCA organization. In this role, she manages the operations of a variety of ministries engaged with supporting and nurturing ELCA congregations and their leaders. Prior to serving in this role, she led 3 different parishes of varying sizes and locations. In Pastor Sara's earlier professional days, she worked as an engineer and during that time earned an MBA. She's married to another pastor, the Reverend Todd Cutter, who serves as the university pastor and director of spiritual life at Lenoir-Rhyne University. Together, they have a delightful daughter, Amelia, and a persnickety dog named Belle. With all of this life experience, friends, God has prepared Sara well to speak with us about conflict and communication and what we can do as courageous leaders to keep the components of conflict from pursuing us. Sara, welcome to our space.
Thank you so much, Jill. I'm really grateful for that. And it's always awkward hearing your own bio, right? Like, have I really done all that stuff? I don't feel like I'm old enough to have done all that yet, but I guess I have. So thanks for allowing me to be here and to be with you. I think it's always a sacred time when you take up someone else's time, and who gets to do that for you. So I really appreciate you being here and want to honor that and hopefully add a little bit of value to your day. Jill asked me to prepare a devotion, and so I think it's interesting how we'll combine everything she just said and hopefully launch into what we're going to talk about later. I thought we would start with a text that suffers from familiarity. 1 Corinthians 13. I mean, who hasn't maybe done a wedding with that text as the selection, but this great one about love. So let's just get that out there as we think about the love that's needed in our world, the love that we share with one another, and hopefully the love that we practice. So this text that suffers from familiarity, y'all say it with me if you can. Love is patient, love is kind, love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable, keeps no records of wrongs. It does not rejoice in wrongdoings, but rejoices in truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. So like all the weddings, right? Like, who's tired of hearing it? But y'all are better biblical scholars than I am. So when you hear that, I'm sure you know that when Paul wrote that, he wasn't necessarily talking about relationships. He wasn't necessarily talking about intimate relationships. He wasn't necessarily talking about marriage. What he was talking about was the community, right? What he was talking about was, this is how the community is called to show up. This is how we are called to support one another. This is how we are called. When Jesus says there, love one another, that was last week's gospel text, right? When Jesus says love one another, these are the aspects of what was talking about. So this is what the community does, and this is how the community acts. And so one thing I like to do with this text is to personalize it. And so if this is how we're called to act, let's read it again and replace love with names. So what if I were to read it and say, Jason is patient. Jill is kind. David is not envious or boastful or arrogant. Nathan is not rude. I'm sorry if I don't pronounce your name right. Verinia. Okay, thank you. Verinia does not insist on her own way. Tammy is not irritable, and Esther keeps no record of wrongs. So David does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in truth. Ellen bears all things, Jim believes all things, and Steph hopes all things, and together we endure all things. So when we hear it that way, I feel like it's a call to action, that these are the expectations that are placed on the community. This is how we are called to love one another. And I feel like this then becomes a tall order, and it really becomes our marching orders for our life together. Because this is the one we keep, right? That's why it's important to practice these things. Because if we skip to the end of chapter 13, what we read is, and now faith, hope, and love remain, these three, but which one's the greatest? Right? Love is the greatest, not because it makes us feel good, but because in the great and glorious resurrection, we won't need hope anymore. Our faith will be complete. But what we practice in love of God and love of neighbor will remain. Okay? So with that in mind, let's have a prayer. Big breath in, clean all the gunk out from the day. Gracious Lord, we give you thanks for this time. We give you thanks for the ministry of coaching. We give you thanks for this platform that allows us to be together. We pray that you would be the silent partner in our conversation, that you would bless this gathering, and that more than anything, you would fill us with love and the love that you call us to share with one another. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so the introduction was that we were going to talk about conflict resolution. And I'm not sure I'm going to get you to a place of resolution, but what I do want to get to is a place of understanding how conflict shows up, how to identify it, and then perhaps some tools to put in place that would be antidotes to what research has shown humans show up in conflict and how we behave in ways that are toxic and destructive, and to start replacing those toxic and destructive behaviors with things that build up relationships. I love the work of the Gottmans, and that's who I'm going to lean on. And one of the things that they say is that in our relationships, the positive interactions need to always outweigh the negative interactions. And they think you can even have positive interactions in conflict. And that comes with things like eye contact, care for one another, checking in with one another. Even when you disagree, you never lose the humanity of the other person. And typically what happens when we're in conflict is, without trying to and without intention, we dehumanize the other so that we can be superior. You guys probably don't do that, but I'm totally guilty of it all the time, okay? So I was first introduced to the work of the Gottmans about 16 years ago. And about 16 years ago, my husband Todd and I were newly married. I was finishing my master's in divinity program. He had just started First Call. We ended up moving, sold his house, bought a house. His dog died. Like, seriously, like in the midst of all of that, we had to put his dog down. He moved in to, we say that the dog that we had when I got married, he moved into our relationship. So it was just lots and lots of change. And so we were having a difficult time navigating that together. And we saw therapists who are just angels on earth. And so she introduced us to the work of the Gottmans. And she said something like, gosh, John and Julie Gottman, they've been doing the best research that I've seen in my career. If you want anywhere to go, that's who I recommend. So since then, I've moderately stayed in touch with their work. I've used their insights with pre-marriage education I did in the parish. And then I went through their level 1 clinical couples therapy, whatever they called it. I think it was just their level 1 therapy course. And I did that in December of 2020, because really one of the best things that's come out of pandemic living is, in my opinion, a lot of the things that you had to spend money traveling to, you can now get the education online. So it's a really difficult course, but at least I didn't have to go to Seattle to take it. So John and Julie Gottman are fabulous. They are a married couple. They're both clinical psychologists. They practice in Seattle. Julie Gottmans still has a practice that she runs. Her husband, John, is more of the researcher. So he has like math and physics background that then complements the psychology. And they've been doing this work for a really long time. They have an institute now in Seattle to pass on the education and to pass on the research so that they can keep it going. And I was telling Jason and Jill earlier, the only reason they sell their work is to fund the research, because there's just not research dollars out there. So in order to keep the research on relationships that they believe in alive, they've started marketing their work. So John Gottman is the professor emeritus now of psychology at the University of Washington. And it's there that they founded the Love Lab, and they opened that in 1986. So it's been a hot minute. And in the Love Lab, they have researched thousands of couples. And what they have done for 40 years in this Love Lab is invite couples to go live in an apartment. And they agree while they're living in this apartment to have all of their interactions videotaped. Like, raise your hand if you'd be willing to do that. So what they've done with this like thousands and thousands of hours of video footage is quantify when couples are doing well and truly thriving, what behaviors are we seeing as a pattern? When couples are really destructive and it's leading towards separation and divorce, what behaviors are we seeing? And that's what they've studied over the years. I know they're qualitative researchers, and that's kind of become popular through Brene Brown. If any of you have been familiar with her work, she's also a qualitative researcher. And what I love Brene Brown and I love the Gottmans, and they quote one another, which is really good. And when you do qualitative research, a lot of times research shows up with, I have a theory about something, or I have a hypothesis I want to test. Qualitative researchers study people first. And so they start with the research, and then they let the pattern drive what the hypothesis is, and then they test the hypothesis. So with the Love Lab, that's what the Gottmans have done, is studied couples, studied how they interact, and then from that build these theories and test the theories. So there's been a lot of work that's gone into this. And one of the books that I love that they've written that I've used over and over again, that's what we're going to get to today, is 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work. Very dry title. This is what it looks like. 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work. And again, this is about close, intimate relationships, which is what they study. And I'm just waiting for somebody to connect the research that this really goes into all of our relationships. We just practice it the most in intimate relationships. So still waiting for somebody to do the research to connect this everywhere else. But my husband tells me I should do it myself and make my millions. And then I remind him that the only reason the Gottmans sell books is because there isn't any money in this. So we're just going to work on my hunches, but go with me for a second. Okay. So in this book, the Gottmans describe their most influential findings from the Love Lab. And one of the most influential, and what I have found the most helpful and want to teach you today, is the 4 Horsemen. Now, the 4 Horsemen are described in their book in a chapter that's called How I Predict Divorce. Like, I mean, if that doesn't get your attention, I'm not quite sure what will. So in this chapter on how I predict divorce is the 4 Horsemen. And I do appreciate the seriousness with which they treat this. So I think it's easy to say that our relationships sour over major events. And maybe you guys have seen this in your ministry or experienced it in your own life. So you get financial mistrust, infidelity, or something really sensational. And you say, oh, they broke up because of this. But really, our relationships are destroyed or really made on the smallest and most negligent interactions. So when people would see me in the parish, 2 of my favorite questions were, you know, do you say bless you when the other one sneezes? Like, do we notice those insignificant things that pop up in everyday life that affect your partner? Do you make eye contact when the other one walks in the room? And these things sound really goofy, but there are these little tiny moments that we have over and over again that show people that we care, that acknowledge them. I think about spaces like this one, when we have meetings, either in a virtual space or in a real space with our coworkers. Do you look up? Do you help people get in the room? Do you call people by name? Do you say hello? I mean, these are really the tiny moments where we feel cared for. So that's what the Gottmans have tracked, or the opposite, the 4 Horsemen, how we how we harm one another and how to get rid of them. Okay. So what we're going to show and what we don't want showing up in our relationships are these 4 horsemen that they've tracked. The horsemen are identified as criticism, contempt, which is the absolute worst, defensiveness, and stonewalling. And I've got a quick little video that the Gottmans put together to introduce these, and then we'll go over each of the 4 more in depth. So Jason, do you want to help us with that? Thank you, Jason. I love that sort of in your face at the end, right? But hey, why not be a little bit desperate, right? So a word about these 4 horsemen, and hopefully we can get them into our bones just a little bit. So criticism was the first one that they mentioned, and these do build on one another. Criticism is different than a critique or voicing a complaint. We're still allowed to complain, right? That's okay. There's just ways we want to do it that can be a little bit more helpful. So when we complain, a critique or a complaint is about a specific issue. Okay, it's very issue driven. We're going to talk about how we feel about something. We're going to talk about our perspective, and we're going to name it as our perspective. Whereas criticism is a true attack, and it's an attack at the core of someone's character. So in effect, when we're criticizing, it's the beginning of dismantling someone's whole being when we criticize, right? We're starting to dehumanize that other person. And if I don't have to see you as a real person, then I can say whatever I want about you, because that's what I'm trying to convince myself you deserve. And that's really the heart of what criticism is I'm starting to see myself as superior, and I see this as something you deserve to hear. The important thing to learn is the difference between expressing a complaint and criticizing is starting with yourself, starting with where you're coming from. Here's an example. I was scared when you were running late and didn't call me. I thought we had agreed that we would do that for one another. So how can we feed back into what we value? How can we build the relationship up even when there's something wrong? And I also like the words gentle startup. How can we lead in so that we're on the same page? You don't want to have like a gotcha moment with someone you care about, whether that's someone you're working with, someone you're in a volunteer relationship with, or with an intimate partner. There's no winning when you try to get someone else or try to surprise them, right? So how can we get on the same page as fast as possible? A criticism would be something like, you never think about how your behavior is affecting anyone else. I don't really think you're that forgetful. You're just selfish. You never think of others. You never even think of me. Which one would you rather hear? And I think a lot of this, and this is a Brene Brownism, is when you start to feel yourself get heated, if you stop and take a breath, that really is, it's good for your brain better than anything else. So if you find that you and someone in your life are critical of each other, though, don't assume that your relationship is going to come to an end. The problem with criticism is that when it becomes pervasive, it's like a gateway behavior. And that gateway behavior leads to far deadlier things. So deadlier to the relationship, I should say, right? So abundance of criticism makes the victim feel assaulted, rejected, hurt, and then it causes the perpetrator and the victim to fall into an escalating pattern. And that's really what this is about, is stopping the patterns before they get any worse. So the first horseman reappears with greater and greater frequency and intensity, and eventually that leads to contempt. So the antidote to criticism is to talk about feelings, to use I statements, to use fact statements, and to use that gentle startup to give people a warning. Hey, I noticed this and I'm concerned, or I'm confused, and I'd like some clarification on it. So the goal is to state a complaint or state a problem without placing blame and giving it a chance to be discussed, okay? So the second and the worst is contempt. And in the Gottmans research, they have found that contempt is the biggest predictor of divorce. I think we could also say that it could be the biggest predictor of separation from another person or separation from an organization. When we begin expressing contempt, what we're doing is vocalizing is that we think there is something inherently wrong that will never change. And I think this can be directed at a person, and I think it can also be directed at organizations or systems. We think there is something inherently wrong. We do not believe it can change, okay? So this is really active dehumanization. And a fun fact for just how bad contempt is, People who live in a relationship where contempt is practiced suffer from more colds, and they have a more weakened immune system than average. So contempt is truly bad for our relationships, and it's bad for our health. So when we communicate with contempt, the results can be really cruel. Treating others with disrespect and mocking them with sarcasm and condescension are forms of contempt. So are hostile humor, name calling, mimicking, and body language such as eye rolling, sighing, and sneering. If this makes you think of a teenager in your life, I don't think that's accidental, because at some point, these are actually age-appropriate behaviors to separate yourself from your family of origin. The problem is when they show up in ways that are truly destructive and last and make patterns for a long time, okay? So in contempt, contempt is really poisonous to our relationships because it conveys disgust, and it conveys superiority, especially moral, ethical, or character superiority. So contempt, simply put, says, I am better than you, and you are lesser than me. And again, that's really dehumanizing. And I feel badly saying those words out loud because I feel like I'm saying it to you all, and I don't mean to. I'm just trying to teach a point. So the antidote to contempt is a culture of respect and a culture of gratitude. And this is not pie in the sky kind of stuff, but over months and years, truly building friendship and truly building admiration for one another, whether that's in a working relationship or in an intimate relationship. Are we catching people doing things well and celebrating it? Are we thanking people for the things that they do and not taking them for granted? These are really critical for building our relationships. So taking time to invest in the other person is really worth it every time. So the third horseman, and the one that I think is most accepted in our workplaces, is defensiveness. And really, like they said in that little video, defensiveness is just really an underhanded way of blaming someone else for your own behaviors. Often defensiveness can be a reaction to criticism. Shows up in things like, hey, Sarah, you missed the deadline. Well, I only missed it because Todd didn't get me his report on time. So really, he's the one you need to be talking to and not me. If this sounds familiar, it's really well documented in Genesis, in the bit about Adam and Eve and the apple when everybody blames the other, right? It's like the first place that I didn't it was like God comes to Adam and is like, hey, why did you do this? And he's like, it wasn't me, it was that woman you created. The one you created that was the exact match for me. She's the one that caused the problems, right? I mean, we still like the taste of apples. Like, we just can't seem to break out of this one. Okay, so who wants to deal with that? It's inefficient, it's messy, and all we're doing is passing around the blame and spreading around the hurt. So another way I might approach that, if someone said, hey, you missed the deadline, would say, you're right. That's a fact. I missed the deadline, and for that, I apologize. When I was putting this together, I realized I hadn't given my other colleagues enough time to follow up. That one's on me. Next time, I'll be clear about when I need things returned and get feedback in a more timely fashion. I mean, which one of those scenarios is actually something we can work with and move on? When we come with defensiveness, we have to tear down the defensiveness. We have to fix what was wrong. We have to correct, the misuse of blame before we can even get to the problem at hand. And that's really the goal, is to get to a place of reconciliation and addressing the problem or the concern at hand. So the antidote to defensiveness is accepting responsibility and owning our behaviors, even if we can't own it for the whole issue. Own what we can own and then start talking about the rest. I think it's really critical that no one can make us act in a certain way. No one can make us say things. And I'm not sure that we do enough owning our behaviors and owning what we say. And that's really what defensiveness and getting rid of defensiveness is all about. So the fourth and final horseman is stonewalling. And stonewalling really is the height of conflict, at least the height of conflict is defined here. And it's when we have just had enough and we shut down and we shut the other person out completely. It can be a response to contempt. We stonewall as a way to shut the other person out. It's a natural defense mechanism. when we're in a situation where we start flooding. Maybe you guys know what flooding is, where your brain starts to work at like 1,000,000 miles an hour and you start making lists of everything that's going on and you can no longer think rationally. It's when we've escalated, or a fight has escalated to a point where our fight or flight reactors start firing. So that's an amygdala reaction, right? For those of you that like brain science, that's an amygdala reaction. Stonewalling usually in our relationships builds on the other horsemen creeping in over time and time again. And when it feels like we're stuck and we can't get ourselves unstuck. From time to time, we can deal with stonewalling. When it becomes habitual and we never resolve conflict and we never go back to the root cause of problems, that's when we start feeling like we're walking on eggshells with one another and separation really starts to occur, no matter where that relationship is showing up, okay? So the antidote to stonewalling may seem counterintuitive, but it's actually to put boundaries around separation. So the antidote to stonewalling is to mutually agree to take a break. And that break must be at least 20 minutes. If you are a nerd like me, 20 minutes is critical because it gives your parasympathetic nervous system time to settle down. What that means is it's enough time for your body to process the adrenaline flow. It's enough time for that fight or flight response to just take a seat. When you are convinced, when your little brain back here is convinced that you're not going to be eaten by a bear, then you can show up in a conversation and be a whole person. But if everything in your body is saying you're about to be eaten by a bear, you're going to worry about being eaten by a bear. You're not going to worry about, am I taking a breath before I respond? Am I making good eye contact? Am I checking myself for defensiveness and criticism? Am I being sure to show up and pay attention? If all you're worried about is your physical safety, which is what happens when your fight or flight starts firing, you're not going to be able to do that. So if you get to a place of stonewalling, if you're shutting down and you can't respond, or you see someone else you're talking with in that place, the best thing you can do is acknowledge that now we can't communicate. Just to acknowledge that now's not the time. And we have to break for at least 20 minutes. The key to that is agreeing on when you're going to come back to the conversation. You can't take a break and not come back. Like, that's the other side of the boundary, is you have to say, we're going to come back at this time. We're going to come back and talk about it later today. We're going to talk about it tomorrow. And then that's where the trust gets built, is when you follow through and come back and finish the conversation. Otherwise, it falls into the other horsemen. Trust isn't going to be built up. That's sort of your social contract, is to say, I respect that you can't talk about this right now. I may not like that result, right? If I want to keep driving the conversation and someone speaks up and says, I'm sorry, I can't talk right now, but I'm heated and I'm fired up. But the social contract is, okay, I will settle myself down and back out of this conversation, but we are still addressing this issue. We're going to address it when we're in a better place to talk. And of course, the Gottmans also have some really good tools about coming back from that involve, I mean, it feels so robotic, but actually sitting down, writing 5 good things that you're grateful for, sharing them before you get back into what the problem at hand was. And what that does is start to reverse the positive to negative interactions, to be sure that what we're building on, we both know why it's important to us. It's not just assumed, but you hear someone else articulate, this is why I'm grateful for you. And then that's your foundation to move forward. Okay, so that's my intro to the 4 horsemen. I hope it's enough for you to talk about. I hope I haven't taken too much of your time, Jill. So with that, I know I gave some discussion questions earlier this week for you all to share, and I'm around if you want to revisit anything. So do you want me to go ahead and introduce the discussion questions? Do y'all want to take that? Okay, thanks. I was like, nobody's unmuting. So the discussion questions I have for you, and I can pop them into the chat too. I'd kind of like you to start with one another, just thinking about talking through what emotions did today's topic stir up for you? How did this feel talking about it? Where did you resonate with it? I wonder, where have you experienced one of the 4 horsemen recently? What sort of memories popped up into your mind in recent memory? What new insight from today will make a difference in your life and in your context? And then what's one thing that you want to put into practice this week that we've talked about? So let me get those for you. And
Sarah, I already put them in the chat for you.
Oh, I moved the window. Thank you so much.
No problem.
So.
Cool. So you want to be in the breakout rooms for a few minutes then? Yeah, okay. So we'll do that for about 10 minutes and bring you back about 10 till, and we'll discuss together.
Welcome back, everyone. We hope that you enjoyed your small group conversation. And as is our practice, keeping the confidence of your small group buddies, we would love to hear what learnings surfaced for you in this conversation time, or what's a practical step that you're going to be taking with you based on the great information that Sara shared with us today and the unpacking that you were able to do in your small group conversation. I'm anxious to hear.
No one wants to share their conflict.
Yeah.
Well, I had been looking at this related to the scripture passages lately and thinking about church in general, or church, how we're doing church in this really new kind of context, or rapidly changing context. And the last, I mean, the gospel lesson, love one another as I have loved you, you know, command, they'll know you're disciples by my love. And it's like, yeah, how are we doing with that? Well, so, you know, really the idea of, you know, putting some of this, you know, bringing up some of this thing, how much criticism is going on out there, you know, and how much of the response to that is, you know, contempt, defensive,ness, all of the, you know, where do we see that today? It's like, well, pick up social media. And how can the church, you know, and you know, how can we, in terms of being the church, model love? You know, we're working with those things, because people need to hear that, need to see that.
Absolutely, Jim. I'm echoing you 100%. And the devotion that Sara used today is making the sermon that I'm giving on Sunday for sure. I'm using that. So thank you, Sara. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. What else, friends?
I listened to Sarah's presentation, thinking relationships one-on-one. And then in our discussion, we got into a situation in which more than two people were involved. And that really complicates the issue, as was expressed in that moments that we'd had.
So that's a really significant clarification and naming, David. So what, how did that translate for the relationship of just one-to-one, but the relationship of many?
We just got to it at the end, so we didn't get much time to dwell on it. I think that you have to be patient, and you can't fix it yourself. There's got to be others to fix the situation, to rebuild relationships. Mm-hmm. Even if there's a major relationship involved in that, it's still, you're not alone. You can't fix it all by yourself. So it's patient and love, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And having the courage to model the posture that Sara was teaching us today, I think that goes a long way. Sara, what else would you add to David's statement?
It reminds me of one of my good friends. They have 4 kids, and like we were talking about parenting. I only have one. I did it right the first time, nothing to prove, but we were talking about parenting one day, and he said what's been really fascinating, their youngest is they had 3 kind of like about a year apart, and then their youngest is maybe 4 or 5 years younger than her next closest sibling. And he said what's been really fun watching it's 3 older boys and 1 girl. He's like, I'm watching them practice parenting, but also what I'm seeing is, so he held up his fingers like this and he goes, so she has a relationship with this brother, and she has this relationship with this brother, But she also has the relationship when it's just these two brothers. And then there's the relationship when all three brothers are there. But then there's a relationship when the middle brother isn't there. And so that's kind of what I hear describing is like there's individual relationships, but when they come together, there's also a different dynamic. And so how important is it? It's like these things become, like we talked about in our group, was it's better to have these conversations or have this language before things get escalated. And so how do you practice when the boat's not rocking? How do you be sure you're practicing gratitude and affirmation? How are you working on stating like what you need in a way that's not blaming, and to be practicing because it's that muscle memory that helps us then when things get escalated to fall back on these positive things as habits instead of sort of the gut reaction of somebody hurt me, so I'm going to hurt them back. Like how do you interrupt that cycle before it escalates?
I think that one of the other important things about what David was saying, and even with what Sarah's saying now, to incorporate is prayer. Because one thing that was said was that while I can't get through to the other people, I have to wait. What do I do? I pray. And so I trust that God's going to work it out. And then what happens? God answers prayer, and wait a minute, it's happening. And so that's another thing that we definitely have to learn. I was listening to some this morning with the story of Abraham and others, and all the years that they went through, everybody had to wait.
Mm-hmm.
Every lesson, I mean, that God taught anybody in the Bible, a long period of waiting had to take place, and we don't like to wait. And so that's what causes a lot more trouble is we want to jump into it rather than waiting, and just trusting God.
And if you can visualize or start to picture what it feels like if you're in a conflict and it's to the point where you have to take a break, what are you going to do with that break? Like you're the only person you have to deal with. Like what a great opportunity to do exactly what you just said.
Absolutely. And praying for Spirit to open that opportunity
Mm-hmm.
for these principles to really gain traction is exactly what it's all about. And I really love how Sara is emphasizing that it's practicing these things in the little ways that help us really bring it when that bigger conflict is on our doorstep. In the heat of that moment is not the time to get the Gottmans book out and say, okay, now, chapter 4.
On page 2, it says right here, I've got the book, it's even flagged.
Wait a minute, I'm going to roll my eyes at you while I find that in chapter 5. And I just have to say, Sara, I felt so convicted during that part because my son Josh and I were the king and queen of eye rolling. And we did it a lot in good fun. But how easy it is to just slip over that edge, right? Into, oh, now it's a habit. And now I'm in a work situation and I'm on Zoom and they have like speaker mode on. And I just rolled my eyes in a colossal way at Phil Hirsch. Oh, not that I've ever done that, Sara, ever.
Me either, right?
No. Who's next? Tammy.
I would also just, the importance of breath that you articulated, and just, I mean, that break piece. And I was just sharing in our small group that the tool that I often use is from nonviolent communication of 1 minute of quiet and then naming the emotion, so that the self-awareness can be there before you start interjecting the emotion into a conversation that's unrelated, but that you were bringing with you because you haven't attended to what you're dealing with yourself.
Wonderful.
And as my colleague so correctly said, inspiration.
Inspiration. Beautiful. Well, friends, with that, I want to say a huge thank you to Sara once again. Thank you for being with us today, bringing your truth, your encouragement, your hope, everything that we share in the promises of God. We hope that you join us again next Wednesday, May 25th. We will have the Reverend John Martinson with us. He will be sharing his work on how to lead in a multi-systems world and stay healthy. I think a lot of what we will hear will build exactly on what Sara shared with us today. As we leave, a blessing for you. May today there be peace within May you trust God that you are exactly where you are meant to be. May you not forget the infinite possibilities that are born of faith. May you use those gifts that you have received and pass on the love that has been given to you. May you be confident in knowing that you are a child of God. Let this presence settle into your bones and allow your soul the freedom to sing, dance, praise, and love. It is there for each and every one of us. Friends, you are beloved of God. You are seen, you are valued, and we are here to walk with you. God bless you, friends. See you next week. Thank you again, Sara.